Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The motion before this House is this House would require states seeking bailout loans from the IMF to post territory as collateral. So what do we mean by this? So any country sufficiently indebted that it desires to seek a bailout loan from the IMF would have to post land that it would guarantee to cede to the IMF in deed, not like relinquish complete sovereignty of it, in the event that it doesn't pay back the loan, and in ceding, and like obviously the IMF would include this. In all cases, like the land would be proportional to the value of the loan, and we can use judgment as to whether or not like allowing them to post collateral is in the interest of the IMF. So as to that, we have three constructive questions. So first of all, the problem with IMF loans is the status quo, high rates of default and low rates of compliance. Secondly, how dictators and developing countries have used this to the detriment of the population of these countries, and why we think a default mechanism that compensates the IMF for the default is actually better for these countries in the first place. Let's talk about
clarification.
Go ahead.
All right, so you're saying you're going to literally steal personal people's private land in order to pay off this debt?
It's like land owned by the government.
So you're taking the government sovereignty off that land, or are you taking the private property of the citizens of the land?
So like government owns the land in deed, right? And it can sell that land to someone. In this case, it would be just giving it, like, okay, you understand. Good. You'll figure it out someday. All right, so under the status quo, there's a fairly high rate of default with loans coming from the IMF. That is obviously problematic from the perspective of the IMF. Is like mostly a self-funded institution. Moreover, there's a low set of standards for compliance with IMF conditions that they tend to attach to loans. And moreover, the mechanisms that they use to try and enforce those standards, to try and enforce compliance with the structural terms that they attach to loans, are A, incredibly hard to follow through on. The IMF has very little credibility, and B, they're also incredibly harsh, that when they do follow through on them, they tend to be incredibly punitive, and they tend to focus the damage on the people in the country. So how does it change this? So it does a few things. So first of all, it means that any country can no longer, in a consequence-free fashion, just ignore the diktats of the IMF, or just refuse point blank to pay back the loan. Why? Because there is a domestic mechanism by which the IMF has recourse, right? So all of the current mechanisms by which it has recourse are like either political pressure or denial of future IMF loans. And sometimes like higher interest rates that they seek a bond. Yeah. Well.
Yeah, so how are you going to value this land? How's it going to be valued? What's it going to contain? Is there any country on Earth that has enough completely non-arable, non-mineral land to present enough value for this?
Right, so no, it doesn't have to be non-arable, non-mineral, because land rights are valued by the government. So like, and they can assess this. All right, fine. Okay, so under the status quo, the mechanism by which the IMF enforces the conditions it puts on its loans are highly political. So they involve putting political pressure on the governments, on like a government-to-government basis, and they typically involve denial of future IMF loans. So both of these are hard to do, they're hard to follow through, they're hard to use to compel the country in question to actually follow the conditions you set on. And they're hard to do because they look politically bad. But we think, moreover, that they're problematic. Because we think that this is better because it would force compliance effectively, because the IMF would have recourse. But moreover, we think that it changes the incentives that leaders are faced with when they take out an IMF loan. So under the status quo, a leader will seek an IMF loan and not feel very much obligation to actually pay it back. But we think that when there is actual material recourse that the IMF has, when they have credibility, when they have a convincing threat, it changes the incentives faced by these countries. It means that in order to pay it back, because they will desire to pay it back, they'll actually need to change how they manage their country. This is an improvement in two ways. First of all, it allows the IMF some more flexibility. Under the status quo, it is incredibly strict with how it treats these countries. It forces certain very strict policy programs on them. And if they fail to do that, they consider that country to have failed to comply. So under this model, if the IMF believes that these countries have a reasonable incentive to actually desire to pay back the IMF loan, then the IMF will be able to trust these countries based from the perspective of these countries' own changed incentives and the changed incentives of their leaders to change how they manage the country itself, such that the country is more productive and can raise more revenue. So secondly, let's talk about how these loans are used. So currently, under the in the world today, so most poor countries, many poor countries are incredibly resource rich. So this paradox is difficult to resolve, but I want to do it in this way. Basically, I believe that if you give governments access to wealth that is easily extracted, that can be extracted without conditions, they can use that to support themselves regardless of what their people want. So take the example of the DRC. So literally trillions of dollars in mineral wealth, and yet the poorest country in the world. How are these things consistent with So the way it goes is that basically the government of the DRC extracts the mineral wealth, takes it out of the country, sells it, and uses it to support the government itself, right? So the dictatorial government needs to pay off certain interest groups, and it does that. So the problem is that countries like the DRC in the 80s, and many developing countries today, use IMF loans in this way. Why should they desire to do that? Because they're easy. Because there are no consequences for the leaders themselves, the leaders who are faced with these sorts of incentives. So how does this change? So it creates consequences, first of all, but it ties those consequences to the leaders themselves. So these leaders, in order to stay in power, actually need to access this resource wealth. If you tie compliance with IMF loans to the potential to access these things, it changes the incentives for the leaders themselves. So the third thing I want to talk about is a default mechanism, why this is actually good for the countries themselves. So as I said, under the status quo, enforcement mechanisms are hard and harsh. Before I go,
if those leaders need the funds that they get from the resources to actually stay in power, and after your model, they actually pay all that off to the IMF, how do they stay in power post your model, won't lead to a complete collapse of their government?
So I think that's interesting. What he's saying is that the groups that they have to appease will, having failed to be paid off, like stage a coup or something, or revolt or fail to comply. So I think that these groups will see that the leader can no longer pay them as much, won't actually have the incentive to take over the government that he implies that they have. So current enforcement is hard and harsh, requires political pressure to denial of loans in the future. How does this change affect that? So it means that a country that has taken out an IMF loan can engage in a form of bankruptcy. And we think that this is a positive thing for lenders. It means that there's less damage in the future for when you default on the loan. If the loan terms become onerous, if they become too much to bear, as is frequently the case, countries find themselves trapped in debt, find themselves with a loan they cannot pay, and need to seek future loans with more onerous conditions to pay them off. So here, they actually have an alternative. They have an alternative whereby they can assess the value of the land against the ability of themselves to actually pay off that loan. And if they decide that it is better to just default and give up the land, they can do this. So what this means is that when they default, when they refuse to pay, there will be fewer negative consequences to them. That the IMF won't bring to bear political pressure, that they won't be faced with punitive loan terms in the future, because the IMF will have gotten something in return. So on these grounds, we beg to comply.
I thank that speaker very much for his speech, and now call upon the Leader of the Opposition to open up the case for Brown.
Thanks everyone very much. I'm truly honored to be in this round. Maddie, it's been a wonderful tournament so far. So on side opposition, we want to say that it's possible that there are instances in which forcing countries to put up parts of their territory as collateral will in fact incentivize them to not default. We think this will A, be rare, and B, be far outweighed by the harms that are incurred when this backfires. So I'm going to bring you a number of arguments. I'm first going to talk about how this skews regional incentives towards adversarial relations instead of aid and cooperation. And this may even not just be regional and geographical, but in fact global and corporate. I'm then going to talk about how this structures incentives such that in most cases it will actually skew or slow recovery rather than hastening the recovery of a country that is earnestly trying to recover. And third, I'm going to talk about how this reduces the incentive to seek bailout in the first place. This reduces the ability in many cases of countries to seek bailout funds from the IMF in the first place, and why that's bad. In her speech, Maddie is going to talk to you about the potential for further corporatizing and exploiting a lot of these nations in ways that we find to be particularly pernicious. First, though, I want to talk a little bit about what we just heard from the Prime Minister. So first we heard that this creates an incentive to pay back loans. He tells us this is a credible incentive, and this will really incentivize countries away from just taking IMF money and running away from it. So first, lots of things might incentivize countries to do this. Presumably the IMF could levy even harsher sanctions to do this that would perhaps be even more draconian, but that doesn't mean that just because it's an incentive, we should always do it. I think we need a little more analysis as to why this is the proper incentive to use and a successful incentive rather than it is an incentive. There are pretty much any penalty we could put on it would also be an incentive. What we would tell you, though, is that this is actually a bad incentive. This is an excessively punitive incentive. And we would also tell you that the kinds of lands you're going to be seizing, which are government lands, let alone the question of how you can value them and how we decide which that they did lose them, and I'll talk about that a little more when I get to my substantive arguments. The second piece of rebuttal that I want to bring is when they talk about how this disincentivizes, this makes bankruptcy less likely. We would tell you, look, there is always a high cost to defaulting on a loan, always. And there are other ways for the IMF to disincentivize defaulting on a loan. There are ways such as saying you are never going to give them a loan again, which is probably a pretty good incentive, given opening Gov's argument that these countries are often likely to perpetuate their own power structures by continuing to take money from the IMF and continuing to run a successful government just on money that they are continually taking from the IMF and never paying back. I think it's reasonable to say that you can include contracts in loans given by the IMF that make it less likely that people are going to default on them without stealing their territory from them and putting it up for sale. With that in mind, I want to turn to our arguments on this economy. So we would tell you, first of all, that this move skews regional incentives towards adversarial relations instead of aid cooperation. So I think it's quite clear that an ideal global situation would be such that any failing country would receive help from its neighbors, even its economic competitors, in the spirit of having a healthy economy in which everyone is capable of participating equally. On the other hand, though, if you put up large chunks of their territory, assuming that this is in fact valuable territory, which it has to be in order to be a reasonable incentive, if you put up large chunks of their territory for sale, contingent on the idea of them going bankrupt, we have to acknowledge that these countries' economies do not operate in a vacuum. These governments do not operate in a vacuum. Neighboring states and even competing states often have the ability to screw with this country's economy, to make it harder for them to recover, to make it more likely that they will default on their loans. And in the case where this is true, it makes it much more likely that there is an incentive on behalf of competing countries, on perhaps the behalf of neighboring countries, an incentive to force this country to default so that that land gets put up for sale and they can then purchase that land from them. Particularly if this land is the only land that that government has, or the best land that that government has, or strategically placed land, or particularly valuable land. These are all incentives that we think are likely to slow and decrease the likelihood that there will be a recovery in those countries in the first place. The second argument we want to talk about is that this slows recovery in the case of a default. So first, we want to acknowledge that it's not always totally within the control of a government to prevent itself from defaulting on loans. Like, I think that all government is going to say, like, look, as long as the government tries not to default on a loan, it can 100% achieve that goal. It will never default as long as it's in good faith trying. I just don't think this is true. I think people and governments default on loans even when they're attempting to pay them back all the time. What does that mean? It means that regardless of how good an incentive this is, regardless of how significant this collateral is, there will be times when a government is just incapable of paying the loan back, gets the land taken away from them, and then is further crippled as a result of no longer having presumably quite valuable land that they were previously relying on in order to keep their economy in some state of functionality. So I think that that's absurd, but I also think that even after they lose that land, it becomes harder for them to produce, it becomes harder for them to function as a government, but it also fractures their public such that it is hard for them to continue to be functional and continue, I'll take you in just a second, be coercive, go for it.
Why is this worse than a situation in which a government just uses resources to perpetuate itself and actively refuses to develop its own country?
Right, so that might happen, but it will happen on either side of the house, right? Like there is no way to like persuade a government to stop using that money. In the case on their side of the house, if a government is like dead set on just using this money to further its own aims, it will use this money to further its own aims, pay back the loan, and continue on as in the status quo. Like the only time this case genuinely makes a difference is in cases of default, when the country loses land that was not going necessarily to benefit the government itself, but also often the people and at least the economy. Finally, though, we think this discourages applying for bailout funds in the first place. Look, first of all, people have significant and often irrationally strong ties to land. That's why the notion of this case even exists. People think that territory is a critical part of a nation's history and identity, let alone the part that it plays in a nation's structure and economy. We think this, first of all, makes governments reluctant to even risk having to sell important parts of their land, and we also think that to the extent that the government's people has any influence over them, they refuse to allow the government to put this land up for sale. This means countries are less likely to get bailout funds in the first place, hastening their downfall, hastening their destruction, and making life worse both for those governments and for its population. We're very proud of this.
I am not speaking for her speech. I'm now calling upon the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the case.
opposition has misunderstood the state of the IMF today. I think the leader of the opposition has misunderstood the legitimacy and the perceived reputation of the IMF, and the mechanisms that they've defended are basically just the status quo. I think it's pretty clear that the IMF has limited legitimacy when it says we will not give you future loans. I think that's because of instances like the DRC, and I think that does influence state behavior. Our model changes that. Let's talk about some direct reputation before moving into rebuilding of what Brendan brought to you today before we close. So firstly, the LO talked to you about regional incentives. And firstly, she just said, like this idea that people should get help from their neighbors. And I think there are certainly circumstances for aid and like targeted trade with neighbors within regional blocs and that sort of thing. The IMF is distinct from that. It's a certain kind of developmental loan that has particular purposes. I don't think one precludes the other. The next thing she said is this idea that because these resources, presuming they're valuable, it hurts other states around them, and that's for some reason unfair or whatever. I think, firstly, the resources that we're talking about that are implied with seizing the land, perpetuate the power of governments and practices of governments because it funds their operations, it funds them in particular ways, and it gives them less of an incentive to develop holistically, right? And I think that Brendan talked to you about this quite clearly when he talked to you about the resource curse, right? This idea that having an unlimited access to a resource stifles development. And he talked about this in the context of IMF loans because we think they are much like getting them like unconditionally or with limited condition or liminal enforceable mechanisms is much like a resource that you abuse and use unlimitedly. So I don't think that neighbors are necessarily benefiting from the development of these resources right now or the use of this land right now, which is the point, right? We think that governments are using them to perpetuate certain practices that aren't necessarily beneficial to the country itself. And I don't think we saw engagement with that. So I think it perpetuates power in the wrong places and prevents a functioning economy. I think incentives are important here, right? If we talk about the example of Singapore, for instance, a country that is not resource rich and does not have land that could be assessed in this way, they've developed in a much better fashion due to the necessity of diversity, right? And First Opposition talks to you about this notion of limited revenue and how this will be crippling for countries. And I think that's not fair because it forces them to develop in more sustainable ways instead of just resource grabbing, right? And I think that as like an export-driven, resource-based economy is not necessarily what's best for these countries, and in a lot of cases is the cause of the issues within these countries. So actually freezing the access to that could have tertiary economic benefits that I think the IMF would be proud to support. Further, she talks about how it slows recovery. And I don't think this argument was particularly nuanced. It just was like, look, if they don't have access to this revenue, it's going to be harder for them to bounce back, etc. I think it creates, if that's true, it creates a large political incentive within these countries to implement the reforms that the IMF is asking for, right? And I think that there's a duality to the relationship between consequences and the IMF right now that was missed on opposition. Because Brennan tells you that both, like, there are very harsh mechanisms, like there are very harsh paybacks, right? There are large consequences, higher rates of interest, like no future loans, that theoretically exist within the IMF, right? We think those are very hard to enforce, and oft are not, because there's huge political pressure on the IMF not to cripple a country, right? Which is why, in a lot of instances, the DRC, for instance, has gotten loans over and over again with worse and worse conditions. That's bad for the IMF because they don't get paid back. And secondly, it's crippling for the DRC because they have someone who's like taking out checks on their behalf, not developing the economy properly, and then saddling them with worse loan conditions in the future. Go ahead, Dr.
So you talk a lot about the resource curse. You have me convinced there's a potential curse here. Is the solution to just give away all the resources and never potentially benefit at all, or is it just rigorous, externally applied and help institutions?
Okay, so I think that the IMF's function is to enforce certain incentives that are not immediately viable to the country because of like the political situation, right? So if a country has unlimited access to a certain resource and they're going to exploit it and export it, then they will not develop a holistic economy. The IMF wants to enforce certain development mechanisms, that's one of them, in order to give like an overarching, more important development plan for this country, and they do that by giving them a loan, right? So I think that it's not necessarily best for them to give away the resources, but rather use them in trust to enforce conditions that will lead to better development. And I think the particular collateral in this instance is also a good condition for development in and of itself, independent from the other conditions it helps enforce. So I think there's a duality there. So back to what I'm talking about. So I think that if it is true that it is incredibly important for either cultural reasons, economic reasons, and whatnot, it creates a very real incentive for countries to engage with IMF policy. I think it's a legitimate threat because it's one that's easily executed and politically viable. that in the status quo, the denial of future loans isn't something countries will believe or have a reasonable expectation to believe, and that's important. I don't think they have either. And then the third point was, again, I just felt like there might be cultural claims to this land and that sort of thing. Again, I think that we're not really talking about sovereignty, we're talking about like receiving royalties from it, right to develop it, like those sorts of things that are held. We have the deed. People who actually live on it would be like leaseholders, much like they are in relationship with the government right now. So I don't think that necessarily we're talking about large cultural harms happening to this land. But further, I think the protection of any sort of cultural value within a state needs to be met by reasonable institutions and economic development. Obviously, we win on that side of the house. So I think in that sense, this is a more important overarching goal. Let's move into rebuilding. So, I think in Brendan told you first that there are huge, very high rates of default right now, and that's a problem. In response to this, they said even harsher sentences. And Brendan told you the reason that they can enforce them right now is because they're incredibly punitive and hard mechanisms to use. I don't think using even higher rates of interest for future loans is necessarily appropriate in this instance. We said that's what the problem was. They said, why this in particular, right? Why not something else? Because these are resources that are held uniquely by governments. The only other one we can think of, and not people. The only other ones we can think of are like buildings and stuff, right? Like this is a very real resource that a lot of these countries have that are involved in a relationship with the IMF. It uniquely, like it's limitedly punitive to the people involved. I think future rates of interest and that sort of thing are more punitive than the land being temporarily frozen. Further, she said they're used to benefit the public. That's just not true. Right? Like resources that are being developed in Jersey with minimal wealth, that is not benefiting individuals, private citizens within the country to a very limited extent. It's helping the government function in a negative way. She just said, and then the next thing that she said in response to that was just to give them more loans. I already explained that that's not viable. Secondly, Brendan talked to you about abuse and the nature of abuse. And I think that I've already reconstructed this when I said that the loan interest rate in and of itself creates new incentives to develop differently as well as enforcing the conditions. Lastly, he talked about how defaulting is much better for people overall within these countries. We think it's limited in a punitive sense. We think it creates a real political incentives for leaders to pay this back and forces them to treat it differently. For that reason, we're so proud of this.
Thank you for speaking very much for the speech and quote from the Deputy Leader of the Opposition, Julie Gates for her.
that exist right now are bad. Therefore, we should institute another set of incentives that we think aren't so bad. However, I think that a lot of what we talk about how loans are abused now, and how a lot of people default now and don't pay them back, are arguments for not giving those people continual loans, and not actual arguments about why this new set of incentives will lead to them not making those types of decisions. I think we gave you a lot of analysis that was either misunderstood or not engaged with about how this particular set of incentives is very bad, especially when a lot of these funds can be used not just for resource development, but making sure that the country improves since they're applying for bailout funds. If they're in this situation, we should probably not take territory that would lead to them being able to recover, and rather encourage them to actually have the money to pay off these loans in the future. Otherwise, you're encouraging the types of defaults that they find so bad on their side of the house, while also not providing any methodology for them to accomplish any reform in the future and moving forward in the future. So I'm going to go with the extension that I have. I'm going to go through what Jean said, and then I'm going to do the repetition. So the first thing I want to talk about is recovery and what this actually does, because I think that they don't understand how punitive this actually is. They criticize us saying don't give them loans in the future, but want to seize land that is owned by the government in a resource-rich developing country. So what is land owned by the government? Because I just want to make this very clear for everyone in the round. Imagine in the United States, a lot of the land that we own here are like national parks, are like oil reserves, or the different types of reserves that are owned by our government. In developing countries, this is similar. People have resource-rich areas that they can put up for collateral. And if they don't have enough of those resource-rich areas that they want to put up for collateral, they'll probably just seize them from citizens that are politically disempowered and then use those as collateral. I think that creating this line of incentives that encourages what they think are authoritarian governments, or governments that don't actually have a lot of interest in protecting their populations, from doing things that actually lead to rights violations, while also not there is a high likelihood of the territory, the resource-rich territory that you put up for collateral, being seized by the IMF, because that is what the motion was. This land is not leased, this land is taken and then sold to other actors. Who would these actors be? So first, we think that the people who develop resources are largely multinational corporations that have an interest and ability to use the type of systems that they set up in other areas to develop them, and they're probably not interested in making sure that the residents of the area are getting a lot of benefits off of those resources, but rather want to maximize the amounts of individual benefits that they get. This means that you incur things like environmental degradation and other things that are internalized by a country that is already having a hard time maintaining a functioning government. That's what happens on their side of the house when you create those harmful incentives. I'll leave you right if you still have it.
Okay, so in the status quo, private citizens' lands in these circumstances are seized in order to be developed and pay back IMF loans. At best, that's a wash.
Okay, it's like if sometimes they're seized now, but you create a high incentive for them to be seized in the future, I think that creating an even higher incentive is still a bad thing. Like, saying incentives are bad doesn't mean that creating a greater incentive to do an awful thing isn't an awful thing to do. How about we change structures and do something positive instead of encouraging bad systems and then saying, well, the system's already broken, might as well break it a little more because it's already broken. That's not, that's a definition. But furthermore, I want to talk a little bit more about territories, because she misunderstood this argument while revealing our case. So Jean tells you that if there is territory that is resource-rich in certain areas, there is an incentive by the neighboring states to not help that country recover, because if they don't recover, they default on the loan they got from the IMF, and then that territory that is resource-rich will then be for sale, and they can buy it and develop it for themselves. This wasn't an argument saying there should be more cooperation generally, but more cooperation is good, and also let's not incentivize people from buying territory and becoming adversarial with their neighbors, especially when most developing countries neighbor other developing countries, and people cooperating and having good trade agreements with one another helps both of their economies and leads to better outcomes for everyone in these areas. I think this is pretty intuitive and clear, and we didn't get any response to this. But furthermore, we also told you that if there isn't this type of interaction between states, if we make it more adversarial, then you further hurt the government structures that exist there, further hurt the ability for them to develop resources, especially since a lot of people have complementary resources, and working with other states actually helps them develop that. If they don't have an incentive to work with one another to develop the resources that they complement, then it makes it even harder for those nations, again, to recover and pay back the bailout loans. What's the next thing she said? She talked about how this fractures the public, because if it's harder for them to produce and show that they're going to improve, then people don't have confidence in their government. They don't have confidence they want to invest and continue to be productive members of that society, and that again makes it harder for them to be able to recover in the future. But lastly, we tell you that people have very significant ties to land, and that this is symbolically a negative thing to do. I think that the IMF is kind of this very separate and westernized institution, showing up into developing countries and taking what belongs to them, reeks of colonialism, even if it's not really colonialism, the optics of it being something like that is something that would make people very distrustful of Western institutions, especially since we think that oftentimes these Western institutions offer things like aid outside of the economic realm and other types of developmental programs that are good for these states, and we shouldn't create those adversarial relationships between other individual people. Let's go through some points of refutation of what they said. So the first thing they talk about is how right now loans are bad, and in the DRC they're doing crazy things with loans. So I think the IMF should probably just do some loan reform in response to how they're dealing with these loans in the DRC. If they're that awful as they say they are on their side of the house, we probably should also seize land from them and make their government even more unstable and do crazy things there, and corporatize what's going on there. That's probably also a bad idea. We should just focus on improving the types of conditions that are already on loans, or just not give loans to states that are doing this. I think that's pretty intuitive, particularly if there are fungible resources. And the second thing they talk about is bankruptcy. If some countries would go into bankruptcy, this is really bad. But we told you that not all states are able to always pay back these loans, and seizing territory from states that are trying to do good is still something that's on balance bad, and we're proud of it.
Okay, I thank that speaker very much for her speech, and now I will call the member of government to open up the case for Colin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We in opposing government their economies and potentially pay back the loans that they got from the IMF in the first place. We think we've heard a lot of argumentation on both sides about like the incentives to pay back or not pay back, but we haven't heard a deep analysis as to why these countries have a serious incentive not to default. We think in very rare cases, it's very rare that they will default in this situation, so I'm going to go there first. So our points are going to be that, but we think that they absolutely will not default in many cases. Secondly, why we think this is the only way that they can actually access capital, and why territory is the best collateral for them to use, and is thus the best incentive for the IMF to be using for them to be able to capitalize on this land and to be able to develop their economies. And then I'll get into rebutting a lot of the stuff that we heard from the opening opposition and, weaving all that in. So, firstly, why do we think it is philosophically justified to use your territory as collateral, right? We think this happens all the time. Individuals use their homes as collateral, right? Other people use their private property as collateral. Territory is exactly the same as any other asset that you might have. And in this particular instance, we think that many of these nations don't really have anything else besides the land that they've got, right? Like, the DRC doesn't have very much except like forests with lots of minerals underneath it, and they don't have the ability to develop that land now. They don't have the liquid capital that they need to extract their minerals in the most effective way and market them. They don't have the liquid capital that they need to develop those industries. They've just got raw land, which is doing them absolutely no good, and they need capital. This seems like a logical trade. So, the only thing they've got is land. The only way that they're going to access capital is collateral. Why is this? Because many of these countries have a really bad lending history, right? Like a lot of them have defaulted on loans in the past. The IMF doesn't want to lend to repeat risky loans over and over again. It's clearly not doing them any good, right? But these people don't have it, or these countries don't have any other way to entice companies or people like the IMF to give them loans than to put up collateral. Printed collateral, rather than something like posthumous sanctions or threats of punitive action in the future, is a much better solution to this problem. They don't have any other way to guarantee their loans, so they ought to use this, because punitive future problems aren't going to solve that. They've already proven that they're not afraid of defaulting on their loans because they've done it in the past, so this is a much better guarantee to someone like the IMF that they actually will be able to pay them back, right? So, the only way they're going to access capital, and we agree that they need, is through collateral. Why is territory the best collateral for them to use? We think, firstly, because they're not using it right now, right? As we already explained and as we've kind of already heard before. This is something they have a lot of, and they're not able to access it. But secondly, because they have a really, really big obligation to reclaim that territory and make sure that they never lose control of it, right? This is why we think that the rates of default are going to be very low. Because countries have an obligation to their sovereignty. Not only do they have an obligation to it from their people, but they also have a deep attachment to it, and we think that they have a very high incentive not to default.
If land is so important to a government, doesn't this mean that governments that are genuinely trying to get better will be afraid to get bailout funds because they don't want to lose their land?
I don't think so, because first of all, you have to still use a thing that is in collateral. So just because you have given your land as collateral to the IMF does not mean that you can't try to develop on it. Perhaps you might want to use the IMF bailout that you received to develop industries on that land to, develop your economy so you can pay back that, right? We think that they have an incentive to realize this is the best opportunity for them to get liquid capital, as we said, is the only way they're going to be able to recover their economies. So they're still going to be able to enter into this because it actually gives them a relationship that increases the likelihood they will pay back the bailout. Otherwise, they either don't have a bailout and they just continue to suffer, or they pick some other kind of loan that is much more punitive and consequences that they're always going to suffer under either. They don't have the kind of incentive structure that will allow them to just develop and then pay back. So other reasons why we think that people are very unlikely to default, right? Not only do they have an obligation to sovereignty and people care about land because they don't have money and they do have land and they need the opposite things, right? But also we think that they are much less likely to default because this is so much better than the punitive measures. These countries don't listen to things like in the future we won't give you loans because historically they do still get loans, right? They don't listen to things like you might be sanctioned because it clearly isn't going to affect them because they're already struggling a lot. So an incentive like this, which gives them the opportunity to develop a resource in tandem with someone like the IMF, in tandem with other regional partners, try to develop and solve the problems they have rather than just smacking them when they don't solve them and then putting them into a worse position than before, doesn't solve their problems. So now we've established that we think that territorial collateral is the best way for the IMF to give loans because it's the best way for them to guarantee they'll be paid back because countries have a vested interest in their own sovereignty. And because countries have a vested interest in developing their own economies, I'm going to go through and do some rebuttal on side opposition.
Okay, so is the IMF the only international player that is interested in gaining some type of stake in the natural resources of the undeveloped world that was going to give these people loans?
That's a great segue to the multinational corporations argument that opposition gave, so I guess I can just go there, right? So the argument is that somebody like multinational corporations might rather buy this land or might rather have a stake in it, right? We think that that is particularly a wash, right? Because in the status quo, these countries can't develop their land, so what do they do with it? They ask multinational corporations to come in and develop it for them, right? They have foreign oil companies come in, foreign mining entities. So it's a wash. Either way, there's going to be foreign companies working on it. We think under our model, they have more incentive to be able to develop their land because A, they have capital from the IMF, want to develop it so that they can try to pay back these loans under better conditions so they don't default because they want to keep their land, and so it's really unlikely that they will default. But let's go more systematically through what we heard from side opposition, right? So we heard this argument about how it's going to skew their neighborly relationships because the neighbors are going to just like buy up the land that the IMF takes, and then they'll start like encroaching on the territory then, right? So the first problem is we don't think governments are going to put up like the most strategic land they own as necessarily the land that they're going to give to the IMF. It's unlikely they're going to give away all of their territory directly adjacent to their the neighbors that they have animosity with, right? That's like a bad idea. But secondly, they say that they're also going to have better relations with their neighbors. So it's better if they would just collaborate with them and give money that way, and that would solve their problem. We don't see why that couldn't happen, right? They can still have like neighborly collaboration and share resources with them while also being part of this IMF program. Remember, they still retain usage of the land that they put up as collateral. They don't have to just like pretend it doesn't exist anymore. They can use the capital from the IMF and their other like regional partners to try to develop that further. We also hear this argument about why we think it's going to slow the recovery of countries. So the first reason that they give is because like sometimes it's good to default even if you're really in good faith and even if you're really trying. I think the nations are obviously acting in good faith and obviously trying, and for whatever reason they can't pay back in a certain amount of time. They could renegotiate the terms of that loan with the IMF. There's no reason that they can't do that, right? They could like refinance their territorial loan. And additionally, the next argument that they give as to why it's slow recovery is because this idea of like sharing with your neighbors, which we've already answered. Oh, and also this idea about like how people are going to be really upset that they like mortgage their land away, and so they're going to have an incentive not to take that up. We think that people realize their countries need capital more than anything else. They're willing to bite the bullet of putting their land up as collateral because then they have the incentive and the motivation to work towards developing that so they can get out of that cycle. We don't think that this is colonialist, right? Because necessarily you have agreed in this partnership in exchange for this capital that you desperately need, you're going to develop it in partnership. But additionally, if it is, this does seem colonialist to you, you have even more incentive not to default. We think default is very unlikely, and we're proud of the question.
Thank that speaker for her speech. Now call upon the member of the opposition to open up the case for LMD.
Actually, pretty can you throw me that one? Well, we're going to be so bold today as to defend the IMF, find its goals, defend them, and actually defend how they work in this debate. That's how it works. So the thing that we get from the second government, the simplistic first government, is we want an incentive that is as scary as humanly possible in order to get these loans paid back. I think the flaw in this argument is quite simple. It premises that the IMF's sole goal is to have commercial gain and to get the money back from its loans. What we would put to you, Mr. Speaker, is the IMF has much broader goals than that, and that's the reason that the IMF is funded in the first place. It was for allowing political development and political control in these countries as well. This is going to present a huge bunch of problems for them in this debate. We think that this cooperative incentive that currently exists between the IMF, which actually does have the long-term interests of these countries in mind, versus the short-term interests that sometimes these governments do, and sometimes the interests of private corporations who are the alternative sources, as well as other sovereign wealth funds from petrostates in China, are much worse off than they are. Let's start right at the top of the review, though. When they talk about this idea that land is just like any other commodity, I think we've heard a couple of good reasons for this opposition, but I'm going to go a step further in saying that land is something that is inextricably not just an economic unit, and that especially when it's tailored and is tied to the people who are sovereign in that land, it has a social perspective and a social worth that you possibly cannot access on their side of the house. So, put simply, the land that they need to give out is got to be valuable, and they talk a lot about why it's got to be valuable, because that's the basis of their incentive structure that's in the entire case. That value of land will include people who live on it, will include resources which, if they're already valuable, will already be exploited. And if they're government lands, that they're giving them up entirely, meaning that they can't exploit them in the future. We're going to get back to this later in a second. But what this means is that we think that ceding the sovereignty of this land to people, fine, you're saying you're just giving out the deed, but if you're giving out the deed to a bunch of people moving from a governmental system to a private system, it's just the incentive structure of the people who rule over those people. And it makes their interest, the people who are their new landlords, in extracting profit from them, not in governing them well. We don't think that a government has an interest in charging the most rent possible on people who are holding estates that are on government land, we think that it also has a social interest as well. That's what abrogates that. That's what makes land different, in addition to all the other reasons that were expressed by first opposition. No thanks. But here's the best part of this debate, is that the very next thing that Maddie says is she says, well, the government's not going to put up their most valuable land because they know that they don't want to lose it. That contradicts literally all of their analysis about the importance of having an extraordinarily strong incentive. They have, and plus, by the way, I know it's a really mealy mouse model here from first government, but eventually we got to the point that the IMF is the one who's valuing this land. And so there's an external foreign body run by people who are international bankers valuing the land, and they get to assess the land claim. So they're going to have to put up something valuable. But here's the best part here. They talk about all these like unexploited resources, these farms that aren't owned by private citizens, and it's really super valuable land. That doesn't exist anywhere, let alone these developing nations. We think that in Jamaica, your most valuable land is probably your coastline for its tourism benefits. It's not a particularly agriculturally beneficial region, and there's no particular natural resources like oil. So if you're in Jamaica, you're going to have to give up large portions of tourist revenue or whatever it may be and see the sovereignty of people's personal homes to get there. They got to choose something here. Either it's a strong incentive or not. I recommend the strong incentive for the sake of you guys, but that one's not going to fly. Okay, let's get to our case. A lot of extensions, they go in a couple of different directions. We're going to start with the fact that people in these governments typically have a much faster discount rate than those who are in the IMF. What do we mean to say by this? That people who are running these countries typically have an extraordinarily short-sighted vision of what ought to do in their country. We'll give you the example of Cambodia, which to pay off of its loans, sold off and privatized its forests in order to do so by a military junta which knew they wouldn't be in power for long and wanted to pay off debts and accrue more funds by this quick short sale of these kind of resources. Here's the problem with this. In addition to the fact that that discount rate isn't socially optimal, that it's not necessarily socially optimal to sell off large swathes of untouched forests, we would also put to you that it shows an economic naivete to say that these forests are valued at a certain rate, when these countries are probably going to outlast any of the corporations that are exploiting them, and therefore the value that they have appropriates to the people over time in a much longer time horizon than any corporation who's particularly investing in it. So what we would put to you is that forests are renewable. And if you have a social interest in the forest, you have an interest in preserving the forest so that it maintains value over time to your entire society, and not just exploiting it for maximum commercial gain. Sure.
So the reason the incentive shift matters is because unlike the status quo, corrupt extractive leaders actually care about land. The status quo incentives are either punitive towards the people or impotent.
Yours is punitive towards the people because the government's going to be selecting this land. It's going to be depriving people of the land as well. But this gets me nicely into the second thing, which is if the incentive is as strong as you say, and these loans have incredibly tough terms, they're going to make sure that no one defaults on them, where are you going to get your money? We posit on a second opposition that there are two extraordinarily large pools of funding for development in developing economies. The Chinese sovereign wealth funds and Chinese state-run government-run corporations, and sovereign wealth funds of petrostates, such as Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Dubai, etc., etc. What we would put to you, Mr. Speaker, is that those wealth funds do not have any of the political strings attached. And we say we ought to defend the IMF model, which is to say that those political reforms that they encourage, what does the IMF want in these countries? It wants development, certainly, because it wants to make its money back, but it also wants a not corrupt regime. It wants human rights protections as much as it can. We don't get to choose those conditions when China or Qatar is the person who is doing the investment. They only care about money. What we say is that the IMF's incentive structure goes beyond pure profit motive, and therefore what we must do is use it to better those societies. So when we take from first government, no thanks, that the idea of the resource curse is going to be really problematic for people, but they admitted the solution isn't give away all your resources, it is have really good institutions and a long-range perspective. You know what's a great way to get good institutions and a long-range perspective? Inviting the IMF and having structural adjustments that change your economy to be less corrupt and have better state management of resources and less corruption and less diffusion of these resources to, like, say, Nigerian warlords. We think that's a great way to resolve the resource curse, and it's not a good way when you're a Qatari company is coming in and says, give me your oil, you sell it off for a certain rate and just appropriate it amongst the people who are elites within there. But the final thing that we want to talk about is the cooperative interest of the IMF. Which is right now, the IMF has an interest in the loan not defaulting and has no reason to want to default. It's a loss for everyone. What we put you on their side of this is it's not a huge loss for the IMF monetarily if this monetary incentive is so important if you get land on the other end. Therefore, we think the IMF is less incentivized to commit to the kind of structural changes that are necessary for that country eventually to make the changes that might eventually get it out of debt on its own terms in a way that is still socially optimal. That's why we support the IMF. We think they're doing a good job, and that's what I try to oppose.
I thank that speaker very much for his speech, and now call upon the property witness to close out the case on her side. Okay.
Mr. Speaker, members of the panel, I think we can all agree that the problem involved in international lending are not necessarily those that are intrinsically solvable by just doing the same thing over and over again, which is what the opposition in this debate would have you do. What we think you need to do on our side of the House is find a meaningful incentive that you can provide to countries that actually causes them to make the kind of structural changes that the IMF would like them to do, but does not reasonably incentivize them to do under the status quo. So what I'd like to talk about in this final speech is I'd like to talk about how countries regard territory and why it's so intrinsic and why it provides such a good incentive. And then I'd like to talk about how this changes the way that governments will interact with the IMF and actually cause them to have the kind of economic development that we would like to see on their side of the House. And my response is the extension we got outside opposition will be interwoven within this. So with regards to this first idea of how countries regard territory, I think Madi's idea of how states regard territory is really essential was something that got kind of mishandled by the previous speaker. What we're telling you is that because states are essentially defined by their sovereignty over a particular territory, they always have an incentive to protect keeping that territory as part of their obligations as a state generally, not necessarily just tied to the monetary value of that land. So we think by having them put something so fundamental on the line, you give them much more incentive to never default on this and prevent default in all these kinds of ways that you don't necessarily get when you just have them defaulting on a loan that no one really in the country necessarily knows they've taken on. People in their country are going to notice that they're suddenly giving up land to the IMF. This is something that gives them much more reason to actually care about these sorts of things. But then I think he further gets a little bit confused about what we talk about with regards to putting valuable land, per se, or in these contracts. So what Madi said specifically was, we don't think it would make sense, and we don't think these governments actually would put up strategically valuable land that would impact the way they interact with their neighbors or interact regionally. We think they still can put up land that has economic value that could be valuable to the IMF, but that they simply don't have the capital to actually develop in the status quo, to actually turn into development. This is the distinction that we're making that they don't understand. Yes, I'll take front half.
If they were inclined to use loan money to develop these resources, why haven't they done that with the loan money that they are receiving in the status quo?
All right, so this is a pretty simple reason. So right now, there's not a lot of necessarily accountability or visibility for how these countries use the money they get from the IMF. It's a lot easier for it to just go into the pockets of autocrats or whatever. But when you have land on the line, it's much easier for people in your country to notice when it suddenly goes missing and you don't have it anymore. So now you have a much more tangible incentive that's tied to your idea as a nation state that's holding you accountable. It's much different than just having signing on the dotted line about something to do with money. It's fundamentally different. They don't understand that. So why is that important? So they're not going to put up land that's going to jeopardize them like politically or strategically. They can put up land that is valuable, but they aren't able to use right now. So what does this actually allow them to do? So because they're not capable of actually developing this land, we think it actually is in their interest to be able to find a way to monetize the land specifically by putting it up as collateral, right? So by having this collateral that they can put up for loans, what that actually allows them to do is like take vast portions of like Chad or something that aren't actually being used in a reasonable way, where there's a lot of territory that's not actually being effectively developed because they don't have the capital to do so, and monetize that into liquid capital that actually allows them to develop it in a meaningful way. And I'm going to talk now, and so I think that's why we regard territory as necessarily like a valuable carrot instead of a stick that the IMF uses right now that is not necessarily something that's working. So we think it's fundamentally distinct in this way and will be much better used as an incentive in this case rather than punitive measures we currently see that are easy for governments to just back out of. So why does this change how governments interact with the IMF under the new system? Why does this make it better? And why is it better than some of the alternatives that we that the member of opposition tried to describe to you? So first, we think that a lot of these countries have really bad lending histories with the IMF that means that the IMF is not going to want to give them a lot of money anymore. So we think having collateral that allows them access to
IMF funds is a better solution. So why is this problematic? So we think it's problematic generally if these countries don't have access to capital at all, right? Because then that just allows them to not develop in any meaningful way. Everyone knows that's going to be problematic. So then we end up considering these potential alternatives, right? So we get a couple out of the member of the opposition that I think are worth talking about. So we get this idea of having, like, well, what we get out of the opening opposition is this idea that multinationals are just going to come in and take land. It's going to be problematic. So we think this kind of happens on either side of the house, but on our side of the house, we actually give people access to the capital to allow them to develop it themselves. I think it's kind of a similar idea to the idea of the Chinese government or petrostates coming in, is they don't really have the incentive to kind of care about structural reform the way the IMF does. So we don't think they actually end up caring about these things generally for these countries. So we think this is not good. But furthermore, we think that countries will prefer to take IMF funds for a different reason, because it actually gives them long-term control over the resources that they're developing, rather than ceding it over to an interest of foreign interest, or an interest in a petrostate or a Chinese government or something like that. Yes?
Isn't that also a good reason that they wouldn't outsource their land to multinational corporations, but would have to have no choice? Their land was seized by the IMF and sold to those corporations?
All right, so functionally in the status quo, what they end up is this choice where they have this land that they can't develop. It ends up being bought by a multinational or the petrostate or the Chinese government or whatever. Now the IMF is giving them another out, another option, where they still have the capacity to monetize the land in an effective way, to something they were willing to do, but actually gives them a stronger incentive as to why they're not going to default on their loan, because now they have this actual territory on the line in a different way that impacts their sovereignty and actually changes the incentive structure a lot more meaningfully, we think. So why do we think it's beneficial for you to have access to sort of your own capital that allows you to sort of kind of develop these things yourselves? So I think there are a lot of reasons this is true, right? A lot of reasons it's better for you to actually just develop this land on your own. So we think that when you develop it yourself, you actually kind of get sort of regulatory control over it, you get to monetize it yourself, you actually get access to this land in your own way. It allows you to kind of use the funds to your own end, which we think is really important. So all these kind of reasons are reasons why we think these governments are going to prefer to take the IMF option rather than these other alternatives and actually allow them to kind of do these things a lot better. So what we're going to see under the current system is that we think the way these countries interact with the IMF is fundamentally broken. The punitive structures that the IMF tries to impose are not actually capable of causing the kind of change or affecting the kind of change that is actually necessary in this debate. What we think we brought you on Closing Government is an understanding of why this kind of land provides a particularly good incentive because of how it impacts countries that allows them to actually leverage their kind of ability into this kind of land in a particular way that allows them to actually interact with the IMF positively, make them much more likely to take on the reforms that are kind of actually going to change the things that are happening in their country and make them far more developed in general because they now have a strong incentive to not do corrupt, horrible things, but to do productive, good things for their people. We're very
I thank that speaker to decide on this one vote. Okay.
Yeah.
Mr. Speaker, the debate thus far before Colin largely occurred in the vacuum of do we take IMF loans or do we just fail to exploit the natural resources that are literally the only competitive advantage that we as the third world have in terms of any types of resource in a world of scarcity, in the world that we live in. But Colin gives you the idea that you don't need to take the loans where they're eventually going to twist your arm and literally take away land that is your only economic profitability, your only viability in a global market, and even running the risk of that is enough to make these people take loans from other actors that are more than willing to get a stake in this incredibly rich resource that is the third world. We think that the third world literally has the most vast swaths of natural resources that the first world has already exploited. So at the point where they already have an interest in monetizing this land in a certain way, and there are plenty of countries that are going to race to access these types of resources, I don't think there's any reason why an individual in any country in Africa would even risk the land that they have that gives them this incredible advantage when they can go to another option that is not necessarily as bad. And I don't think it's proper for the IMF to twist people's hands in this way specifically, and I don't think you responded to the specific examples that Colin gave you. I'm going to explain that a little bit more in detail and talk to you about another example of Zambia, which is actually a country that has taken significant loans from from China and walked away from the IMF, and they're actually doing just fine in monetizing their resources. And I don't think this is a good precedent because they're not receiving any type of political reform. But what am I going to talk to you about? I'm first going to say that land has a social worth. This is ignored by the closing government. And I think that, first of all, I think the people that live on this type of land, and I think that the country that exists on this land is not just merely a monetization of ground, and it's not just merely a monetization of their natural resources in terms of developmental capital. I think that either, if you want this incredibly strong incentive, which seems to be the only thesis of the government, Mr. Speaker, I think that you're going to have to put up some land which is incredibly important to at least some people in the sense that it represents the only type of money that your nation can get, and at least in some cases it's going to be land that people lived in. And I don't think that you can just necessarily take away this land because it does have a social worth, because it extends via generationally to the people that not only live in your land right now, but live in your land post-generations and continually, right? Furthermore, I think that it's definitely going to hurt certain people and cede sovereignty of the people that live in that type of land. They say we're only going to cede this type of economic land. This is precisely the problem, Mr. Speaker. There is no reason why these countries are going to risk literally their only economic benefit and the only type of way that they're going to interact on a global stage via the economy, because this is incredibly problematic. There's a double bind that I'm going to put the government in. Either they're going to have an incredibly strong incentive, which is the reason why people would never go to this loan because it would be so horrible if they defaulted, or they're going to have an incredibly weak incentive, in which case the entire thesis of the government bench has failed. Right? Two main questions of crystallization. One, in terms of recovery, like what actually happens? Are we going to actually see any type of default on these loans, or what is the incentive for people to go work with the IMF? And secondly, how do you break down cooperation with the IMF on your side of the house, and how do we maintain that, even in the worst case scenario of the IMF not getting their money back? I think that Colin gave you a very good case as to why the IMF should not necessarily be concerned with how much money they make or how much money they get back. They should probably be more concerned with the development of the developing world and with significant political reforms that help people that are the most disadvantaged.
So, considering that these states have incredibly bad rates of default and really bad records already, how are they going to get loans from anyone else if they don't put up collateral?
Okay, the point was this, right? The rest of the world that is already developed is looking aggressively to find these pools of natural resources that they have already exhausted in the rest of the world, right? The oil that we have in Africa is so incredibly vast that other countries are going to jump on this opportunity to take it. Like it's also like your question also flies in the face of empirical evidence. Like look at the example of Cambodia, right? When generals took power in Cambodia, they literally sold away the rights to their national forests just to multinational corporations so that they could be burnt down and sold as timber, right? Because generals understood that this was the best way for them to make a dime on the individual level, right? The IMF would probably not have hacked and slashed down all the natural forests of Cambodia because they were probably more concerned with the long-term sustainability of these specific countries. Whereas generals that exist in the short term don't really care about this type of long-term sustainability. And even if they did, I don't think that there's any necessary difference for them in terms of the money that they get from China or the money that they get from petrol states as opposed to the money that they get from the IMF. Firstly, in terms of recovery, I think the IMF proposes incredibly draconian standards, and it's difficult to simultaneously exploit resources and develop your infrastructure. If this was not the case, Mr. Speaker, then there would never be any problem of any state defaulting, right? Because no state would voluntarily default on any IMF loans, right? We understand that it's functionally difficult for some states to not default on IMF loans. That's why you have a problem alongside government. They say the only way that we can stop states from, not defaulting is by putting an incredibly strict or incredibly harsh incentive on them to default, which is basically like screwing you over and saying, absolutely no, this is the worst case scenario for you guys, giving up half of your government, right? We think this is functionally bad, one, and it's a reason why we would be why a state would be scared of going to the IMF because it runs the risk of losing this type of thing, especially when you say these states are already states that have a risk and have defaulted in the past, right? They have no reason to think that this new loan would be a good loan that they would be able to pay back just because they're assuming a lot of risk. I think that people would understand that if they didn't, if they defaulted in the past, they're running a significant risk of defaulting in the future, right? You say that you need to bite the bullet to put up land as capital. This is the exact type of thing that we're talking about. You are functionally twisting their arm. This is not a world where the only way that they can monetize these resources is by going to the IMF. And there's other pools of capital that you can actually draw access from. Why would they pick the IMF when the IMF runs the risk of losing a significant amount of their sovereignty and losing a significant amount of their economic profitability and viability? I don't think deficits are the only important thing. Furthermore, and lastly, in terms of political development, what is the IMF's actual goal? IMF's actual goal, Mr. Speaker, should be to actually create development for the world in a meaningful, long-term, sustainable sense, which is why one of the things that the IMF cares about is long-term infrastructure development in terms of building roads, in terms of building schools, whereas other countries like China and the petrol states only care about short-term extraction of resources. I think the IMF should definitely be willing to bite the harm of some loans that are defaulted upon if they can actually see, or if they can actually gain some type of benefit to these countries, which we are seeing in the status quo. I don't think it is necessarily as dire as they're painting. They never gave you the express harm of the IMF losing a little bit of money here and there, which is, by the way, the worst case scenario that you're seeing on side opposition. I don't think we should be looking at short-sighted visions in order to maximize short-term economic profits. I think the IMF is a lot more concerned with long-term development and long-term sustainability, human rights and development, and the IMF should not necessarily be interested at all in their profitability margin. They should be interested in what is the best type of loan, what's the best type of development loan to issue to these third world countries that will actually make them long-term sustainable and long-term viable. So because we've proven to you that these states are not going to risk the only type of economic viability that they have by going to the IMF, and go to other states that we've proven to you already exist or trying to get the resources, and because we've proven to you the IMF should not be interested in just making a buck, they should be interested in helping out these states, we're very proud.
I thank that speaker for his speech and everyone for that debate. If you all want to come forward,